I stood in the parking lot of Riverside Memorial Gardens in Sacramento, watching my stepmother Jennifer and my half-sisters Madison and Chloe walk past me like I was invisible. They were dressed in matching black designer dresses, their hair professionally styled, while I wore the only black dress I owned from Target that I'd bought 3 years ago. Jennifer's hand was on Madison's shoulder, guiding her toward the chapel entrance, where my father's memorial service was about to begin, and when I tried to follow them inside, Jennifer's brother Marcus stepped in front of me with his arms crossed. "This is a private service for family only," he said, his voice loud enough that people turning into the parking lot could hear. "You're not on the list." I felt my hands start to shake, not from sadness, but from that specific kind of rage that comes from being erased by people who have no right to erase you. My father had died 2 weeks earlier from a sudden heart attack at 58 years old. I found out about his death, not from Jennifer, not from my sisters, but from a Facebook post that one of his coworkers shared. The post had a photo of my dad at his desk at the insurance company where he'd worked for 30 years, smiling in his favorite blue tie, and the caption said something about how he'd be missed by everyone who knew him. I stared at that post for 20 minutes in my apartment in Oakland, my coffee getting cold on the table, trying to understand how my own father could die and no one would think to call me. When I finally picked up the phone and dialed Jennifer's number, she answered on the 5th ring and said in that sweet, poisonous voice she'd perfected over the years, "Oh, sweetie, I was going to call you eventually. We've just been so overwhelmed with arrangements. The service is private, just immediate family, but I'll let you know when we're doing something more public." Then she hung up before I could respond. The thing about being the child from a first marriage is that you become a ghost in your own family history. My mother died from ovarian cancer when I was 11 years old, and for 2 years it was just me and my dad in our little house in Elk Grove, eating frozen dinners and watching baseball games on the couch, and slowly learning how to live in a world without her. Then my dad met Jennifer at a company conference in San Diego, and 6 months later she moved into our house with her daughter Madison, who was 8 at the time. A year after that, they got married in a ceremony where I was asked to be a junior bridesmaid but wasn't allowed to give a speech or participate in any meaningful way. 2 years later, Chloe was born, and that's when I stopped being a daughter and became something closer to a live-in babysitter who also happened to eat meals at the same table. Jennifer never did anything dramatic enough that my dad would notice. She didn't scream at me or lock me in closets or do any of the things that people imagine stepmothers doing in fairy tales. Instead, she did something much more effective. She made me small. When my dad would come home from work, Jennifer would already have Madison and Chloe's days planned out for him to hear about, their accomplishments lined up like trophies, while anything I tried to share would be met with, "That's nice, honey," before she redirected the conversation. When it was time for school shopping, Madison and Chloe got to go to Nordstrom and pick out entire wardrobes while I got a $200 budget at Ross and was told I should be grateful for practical clothing. When Madison wanted to take horseback riding lessons at a barn in Folsom, my dad paid $400 a month without blinking. But when I asked if I could join the school robotics team that required a $100 fee and stay in after school twice a week, Jennifer told my dad it was too much of a scheduling burden, and maybe I should focus on getting a part-time job instead. The money thing became impossible to ignore by the time I was in high school. My dad made good money, probably around $90,000 a year after his promotions, and Jennifer didn't work. So, theoretically, we should have been comfortable. But somehow, there was always money for Madison's travel soccer team and Chloe's piano lessons and family vacations to Hawaii, where I was left behind because someone needs to watch the house and we can't afford 5 plane tickets. Right now, when I turned 16, I didn't get a car like Madison did on her birthday. I got a card with $50 in it and a lecture about the importance of saving money. When it came time to apply for colleges, my dad sat me down and explained that he'd be able to help me with community college costs, but that I should primarily plan on working and taking out loans because Madison would be starting at UC Davis soon, and that was going to be expensive. I remember sitting there at the kitchen table doing the math in my head, and realizing that my dad was going to pay $35,000 a year for Madison's school, but couldn't find money to help me with the $8,000 a year it would cost for me to live at home and attend Sacramento City College. I moved out 2 months after I graduated high school. My dad seemed almost relieved when I told him I'd found a roommate situation in Oakland, near where I'd gotten a job at a medical supply company. Jennifer hugged me and said she hoped I'd visit often, but her eyes were already calculating how she could turn my bedroom into a craft room. I did visit, maybe once every 2 months, and every time I did, I felt more like a stranger in the house where I'd grown up. The photos on the walls were all of Jennifer's family. The vacations they planned never included an extra seat for me. The holidays became performances where I was given the least comfortable chair and served dinner last and expected to be grateful just to be included at all. But I kept showing up because he was still my dad. Underneath all of Jennifer's carefully constructed narrative, underneath all the ways I'd been erased and diminished and pushed to the margins, he was still the man who used to make me pancakes on Sunday mornings and taught me how to change a tire and told me I could be anything I wanted to be. I held on to this idea that someday he'd see what was happening, that he'd wake up and realize how differently he'd treated me compared to Madison and Chloe, and that he'd find some way to make it right. That hope is what kept me driving an hour each way on Thanksgiving and Christmas, sitting through dinners where no one asked about my life, accepting birthday cards with $20 in them while Madison got a trip to New York for hers. The last time I saw my father alive was at Chloe's high school graduation party in their backyard, in Elk Grove. It was a Saturday in June, blazing hot, and Jennifer had hired a catering company and rented one of those big white tents and invited what looked like 100 people. I'd driven up from Oakland after working a morning shift, and when I arrived my dad was manning the grill in his Kiss the Cook apron. He smiled when he saw me and gave me a quick hug that smelled like charcoal and Old Spice. And then Jennifer appeared from nowhere and guided him away to meet some neighbors I'd never seen before. I spent 3 hours at that party, and I don't think anyone spoke to me for more than 5 minutes total. When I finally left, I hugged my dad goodbye in the driveway and he said, "Don't be a stranger, sweetheart." And I said, "I won't, Dad." And that was the last conversation we ever had. So standing there in the memorial parking lot with Jennifer's brother blocking my path, something inside me finally broke. Not in a screaming, crying, dramatic way, but in the way a bridge cable snaps when it's been bearing too much weight for too long. I looked at Marcus and said very calmly, "My father is in that building. I'm going inside." Marcus stepped closer, trying to use his size to intimidate me, and said, "Jennifer made it clear that you're not welcome. This is a private service, and if you try to force your way in, I'll call the police and have you removed for trespassing." Behind him, through the chapel windows, I could see people starting to take their seats. I could see the photo boards Jennifer had set up, and even from a distance I could tell that I wasn't in any of those photos. I'd been edited out of my own father's life story. I got back in my car and sat there with my hands on the steering wheel while the service started without me. I could hear music playing from inside the chapel, something classical that my dad would have hated because he only ever listened to classic rock. I watched people I didn't recognize file inside, co-workers and neighbors and Jennifer's extended family, all of them getting to say goodbye to my father while I sat in my 10-year-old Honda Civic in the parking lot. And that's when I stopped crying and started thinking clearly for the first time in years. Because there was one thing Jennifer didn't know, one piece of information I had that she wasn't expecting. 3 months earlier, my dad had called me on a random Tuesday night, which was unusual because we mostly communicated through brief text messages. He sounded tired on the phone, older than usual, and he said he wanted me to know that he'd updated his will and that I was going to be taken care of. He didn't give me details, just said that he knew things had been complicated over the years, but that he wanted me to know I was his daughter and he loved me. I'd thanked him and we'd talked for maybe 10 more minutes about nothing important, and then he'd said goodbye. At the time I'd figured he was just feeling sentimental, maybe going through some midlife crisis reflection. Now, sitting in that parking lot, I realized it might have been the only honest conversation we'd had in years. I drove home to Oakland and spent the rest of the weekend in a strange, numb state where I couldn't quite process what was happening. On Monday morning, I called the law office that had handled my father's estate planning. I'd found the name on some paperwork in my apartment. An attorney named Robert Chun who had an office in downtown Sacramento. His receptionist told me that Mr. Chun was handling the administration of my father's estate, and that there would be a reading of the will on Friday afternoon. She asked for my contact information and seemed surprised when I gave it to her. like she was checking a list, and my name was definitely supposed to be on it. That phone call was the first indication I had that maybe, just maybe, my father had actually meant what he'd said on the phone that night. The will reading was scheduled for 2 o'clock on Friday at Robert Chun's office, which was in one of those modern glass buildings near the Capitol. I took the day off work and dressed in my most professional outfit, black slacks and a blue blouse that I usually saved for job interviews. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the waiting room, my stomach twisting with anxiety and something that might have been hope. At exactly 2 o'clock, the receptionist led me into a conference room where Jennifer was already seated at a large wooden table, with Madison and Chloe on either side of her. The look Jennifer gave me when I walked in could have frozen gasoline. She opened her mouth to say something, probably to demand to know why I was there, but Robert Chun entered right behind me and gestured for everyone to take a seat. Robert Chun was a man in his 60s, with gray hair and the kind of calm, professional demeanor that must take decades to perfect. He sat at the head of the table, opened a folder in front of him, and began by expressing his condolences to all of us. Then he started reading the will. The first part was standard legal language about my father being of sound mind and body when he made these decisions. Then came the specific bequest. To Jennifer, my father left the house in Elk Grove and a $50,000 life insurance policy. To Madison and Chloe, he left $10,000 each for educational expenses. And then Robert Chun looked directly at me and said, "To my daughter Emma Christine Morrison, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all investment accounts, retirement funds, and my share of the vacation property in Lake Tahoe, with a current total estimated value of approximately $470,000. The silence in that room was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming. Jennifer's face went from pale to red to a color I didn't know human skin could achieve. Madison looked confused, like she was trying to do math that wasn't working out in her head. Chloe just stared at the table, and I sat there feeling like the floor had disappeared beneath my chair. Because $470,000 was more money than I'd ever imagined having in my entire life. It was enough money to pay off my student loans, to buy a house, to stop living paycheck to paycheck for the first time since I'd turned 8. It was also proof that my father had seen exactly what was happening in his house and had found the only way he knew how to make it right. Jennifer found her voice first. She stood up so fast, her chair rolled backward and hit the wall, and she said in a shaking, furious voice, "This is insane. This is absolutely insane. Emma hasn't been part of this family for years. She barely even visited. There's no way David would have done this. Someone must have influenced him, manipulated him. This will is invalid." Robert Chun didn't even blink. He pulled out another piece of paper and slid it across the table to Jennifer. "Mrs. Morrison, your husband met with me 4 times over the course of 6 months to discuss his estate planning. He was very clear about his intentions and his reasons. This document here is a letter he wrote explaining his decisions, which he requested be read if there were any disputes." Jennifer snatched the letter before Robert could continue. Her eyes scanned the page, and I watched her face go through another series of transformations. Whatever my father had written, it was cutting through her carefully constructed narrative like a knife through paper. When she finished reading, she put the letter down on the table, and her voice when she spoke was quieter, but somehow more venomous. "You manipulated him. You always were a manipulative little girl. You called him that night and convinced him to cut out his real family." I felt something cold settle in my chest. I looked at Jennifer across that conference table, at this woman who had spent 17 years erasing me and diminishing me and treating me like an inconvenient obligation, and I said, "He called me Jennifer. Not the other way around, and if anyone was being cut out, it wasn't from his will." Robert Chun cleared his throat and explained that as executor of the estate, he would need approximately 60 days to finalize everything, and that we'd each receive detailed documentation of all assets and their distribution. Jennifer tried to argue, tried to demand answers, but Robert remained professional and firm. The meeting ended with Jennifer storming out of the conference room, Madison and Chloe trailing behind her, both of them looking back at me like they were seeing a stranger for the first time. What Jennifer didn't know was that my father had been even more thorough than she realized. In the letter Robert Chun had shown her, My dad had documented everything. He'd written about how he'd realized too late that Jennifer had been treating me differently from her own daughters. He'd listed specific examples of the financial disparities, the exclusions from family events, the ways I'd been made to feel like I didn't belong in my own home. He'd written that he'd been too weak to confront it while he was alive, too afraid of conflict, and too comfortable with the peace that came from letting Jennifer manage the household. But he'd also written that he couldn't die knowing he'd failed me, that he couldn't leave this world without trying to balance the scales in the only way he still could. The letter ended with an apology to me and a request that Jennifer respect his wishes and not contest the will. Jennifer contested it anyway. She hired a lawyer and filed paperwork claiming my father had been mentally incompetent when he made the will and that I'd exercised undue influence over him. I hired my own attorney, a woman named Sarah Patel who specialized in estate disputes. Sarah was sharp and strategic, and when I showed her the years of documentation I'd been keeping without really knowing why, text messages and emails and financial records that showed the pattern of unequal treatment, she smiled and said we had a strong case. The legal process took 4 months. During that time, Jennifer's attorney tried multiple strategies to discredit me and my claims. They subpoenaed my phone records trying to prove I'd been in constant contact with my father before his death, which backfired when the records showed I'd actually called him less than once a month. They tried to argue that I was a gold digger who'd never cared about my father, which fell apart when Sarah produced evidence of all the times I'd tried to maintain a relationship despite being excluded and diminished. The breaking point came during a deposition where Sarah questioned Jennifer directly about her treatment of me. Jennifer tried to maintain her facade at first, claiming she'd always treated me like one of her own daughters. Then Sarah started walking her through specific examples. Why had Madison received a car for her 16th birthday when I hadn't? Why had my father paid full tuition for Madison at UC Davis but told me I needed to rely on loans for community college? Why was I not included in family vacations over a span of 8 years? Jennifer's answers became increasingly defensive and contradictory, and when Sarah pulled out photos from Madison's Sweet 16 party, an elaborate event at a country club in Roseville, and asked Jennifer to identify everyone in the pictures, Jennifer couldn't explain why I wasn't in a single photo. Because I hadn't been invited, the judge ruled in my favor. He stated in his written decision that my father's will was clearly the product of a sound mind attempting to remedy years of demonstrated unequal treatment, and that Jennifer's claim of undue influence was not supported by any credible evidence. The estate would be distributed exactly as my father had specified. Jennifer was ordered to pay her own legal fees, which totaled around $30,000. I received the final disbursement check on a Tuesday morning in March, almost 9 months after my father died. $487,000 deposited directly into my bank account. I did practical things with the money. I paid off my student loans. I put a down payment on a small house in Sacramento with a yard and a garage and a kitchen window that gets morning light. I invested the rest in index funds and retirement accounts, setting myself up for a future that doesn't involve living paycheck to paycheck and stressing about every car repair and medical bill. I didn't buy anything extravagant or take any expensive trips. Mostly I just bought myself security and options, and the knowledge that I'll never have to depend on anyone the way I once depended on my father to see me and value me. I visited my father's grave for the first time on what would have been his 60th birthday. It's in that same memorial garden where his service was held under an oak tree near the back of the property. I sat on the grass next to his headstone and talked to him like I used to when I was a kid, telling him about my new house and my promotion at work. I told him I understood why he'd done what he did, even if I wished he'd found a way to stand up for me while he was alive. I told him I forgave him for the years of silence, for all the times he could have intervened and didn't. And then I told him goodbye in a way I hadn't been allowed to do at his memorial service. The truth about family isn't what they show you in movies or greeting cards. Real family is built through consistent actions and choices, and showing up for each other even when it's complicated or inconvenient. My father tried to do that for me in the only way he knew how at the end of his life. And I'm grateful for that, but I'm also clear-eyed about what it means. It means I spent 17 years being made small by a woman who saw me as competition. And it means my father saw it happening and chose comfort over confrontation until he was literally planning for his own death. I don't have contact with Jennifer, Madison, or Chloe anymore, and I'm okay with that. Some people might say I should have been the bigger person, should have offered to share the inheritance equally, should have tried to maintain some kind of relationship with my half sister. But I spent enough years accepting less than I deserved, and I'm done doing that. Standing up for yourself is always worth it, even when the cost is high. My father's will wasn't just about money. It was about someone finally saying out loud that I mattered, that the way I'd been treated wasn't okay, that I deserved more than I'd been given. If you're reading this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you're the child who was always treated as less than, the one who was excluded and diminished and told you were being too sensitive or imagining things, I want you to know something. You're not crazy. Your experiences are real. Document everything. Save the emails and the text messages and the receipts. Pay attention to the patterns and the discrepancies. Believe yourself when something feels wrong, because your instincts are probably right. And when the time comes, whether that's through legal action, or simply walking away, or setting boundaries that protect your peace, choose yourself. Choose your dignity. Choose the truth of your own experiences over someone else's comfortable narrative. What's your story? Have you ever been the forgotten child in your family? Drop your story in the comments below.